I was baptised David Henry Mattiske, born on the 22nd of May 1925 in Palmer, South Australia, and after a long business career with the Shell Company and in the hotel motel industry in Victoria, we came to the Gold Coast, retired here, and we've been living in sunny Queensland now for the last 36, 37 years. But when I was a few months old, my parents shifted to a town in the Wimmera district in Victoria, Mattiske, on the main Melbourne to Adelaide railway line. So I grew up in Mattiske, a fine little town of about 1,200 people, pretty prosperous, good farming area. Then I was ready to go further in schooling to do matriculation, so I had to board in the big town of Horsham, the centre of the area. From school I joined the Shell Company depot. In those days the oil companies had depots in all the major centres. After a long journey through Australia to finish up in Townsville, looking for Shropshire, we're flown across to Melbourne Bay, which was a hellhole at the time, and we get off the aircraft and go to the depot, and the commander of the depot comes out and said, "What are you people doing here?" And we said, "We're on draft to Shropshire." He said, "I don't know where it is. You'll just have to stay here for a few days and we'll put you to work," which they did. After a couple of days we get a call, "Get your gear," which we had no gear anyway because we were travelling light. Shropshire has arrived in port back again. So out we go and I joined Shropshire. A junior officer takes me through the ship, showing me a few things. "You'll be a forecastle at the front of the ship, looking after, working in that division. And your action stations will be in the shell room of A turret," which I knew nothing about anyway, but I was going to learn. At sea, you'll be a lookout on the starboard wing of the bridge with a pair of binoculars. "Oh, what do I do there?" "Well, you just look around and tell people what you see." After a few weeks, it'd be about, perhaps 8 or 9, 10 days in port, the force is gathering and we're going to do an operation. And we leave Melbourne Bay and we're heading to a place called Cape Gloucester. That was going to be the first major assault by General MacArthur before the great campaign took place across the Southwest Pacific. On the night, on the morning watch, before we were to get into the Japanese positions and bombard them, I'm on the starboard wing of the bridge with the binoculars. Just a pair of binoculars around your neck there, you're looking at everything. But by this time I'm beginning to know where other ships in the area should be. And looking astern backwards a bit to the stern, I see a white object in the water. It looks like the bow wave of a ship proceeding at speed, and it shouldn't have been there. It had never been there before, and I thought, what do I do? I've been on the ship here a few weeks. I've never done this sort of thing before. Well, I better yell out. I yell out, "Starboard lookout, compass platform." A head appears over the parapet and said, "Yes," and I tell him what I see. "Oh, thank you." There's a lot of activity on the compass platform, and then the same head appears over the parapet and said to me, "Thank you, lookout, everything under control, carry on." Apparently it was an American destroyer that was out of place and shouldn't have been there, but I did the right thing by reporting it. After the operation at Cape Gloucester, which all went well, we're back at anchored off Buna, and I get called to the gunnery office. "You'll now be manning the Port Evershed bearing indicator." Now, why they did that, I don't know. Perhaps it was because I appeared to be alert before the last operation. And the Port Evershed bearing indicator was the centre of on the port side of what is called the compass platform, the control place of the whole ship. The compass platform had the officer of the watch, the navigator, the gunnery officer, and if he was required, the captain sat on a stool and he sat next to the Port Evershed bearing indicator, and this was known as the captain's lookout. And from then on, I was a lookout in one of the lookout teams whenever we went to sea and did operations. And even as a young lad, and I was still just over 18 years old, but because I was always interested in history, I was aware that I was seeing history unfold before my eyes. The fleet started to build up. There was the cruisers, first of all the Phoenix and the Nashville, Shropshire in Australia, the county class cruisers, and our destroyers. And then the Boise arrived, and then as operations proceeded through New Guinea towards the Philippines, more forces arrived, and we knew we were going to create history. We bombarded or helped bombard and take the Admiralty Islands, which is now known as Manus, famous for other reasons at the moment. We did along the coast of New Guinea bombardments, then Dutch New Guinea, Tanamera Bay and Humboldt Bay. A huge operation, and the first of the big operations which MacArthur was able to do once we got away from New Guinea. We bombarded different places along the Dutch New Guinea coast, and then a big operation at Biak. After Biak we came home for a bit of a clean-up, but then we were back there a week or two later, and eventually there was going to be a big operation at Morotai. That was going to be a long way away. That went off smoothly, and we're back off Biak having a rest, and we had been told we were going to get a new captain, an Englishman from the Royal Navy. That didn't go down too well. We thought to ourselves, we don't want a Pommy over here telling us what to do. What would he know about the Pacific War and its operation? It'd be interesting to know what sort of a bloke he was. He arrived one Saturday afternoon. He'd been flown up to Biak apparently by the Americans, and he came out to Shropshire. Next morning at divisions, because we were in a safe port, there were the usual Sunday morning divisions and captain's rounds. By this time I'm smart enough to know you keep out of the way of captain's rounds. You know, everybody has to be at attention and on their best behaviour when he comes around. So I'm up on B deck. The bugler precedes the captain and the other officers, I hear the bugle blow, along comes this bloke, and he walks out to the forecastle beside A turret, and there was our divisional officer, the chief petty officer, a couple of petty officers and leading seamen standing waiting to receive him. And instead of being very rigid and saluting stuff, he walks straight up and he puts his hand out and shakes hands with them. I thought, hello, this is interesting. Perhaps this bloke's not too bad after all. It turned out to be Captain Charles Arthur Godfrey Nichols, one of nature's gentlemen, a brilliant strategist who could read the war like we could read our own hands. He understood what was going on. A wonderful captain making the right decisions. But he was also a very devout Christian and a believer in empathy with his men. And we all got to love him. Particularly people like myself, who was in a team that did the lookout work. And he was a sort of captain that would come up and sit down in his stool for a few minutes to look around. He'd say, hello, how are you? Now listen, lad, if you see anything interesting, you let me know. Thank you, sir. That's all right. And he became our Shropshire's longest serving captain. The next great operation was to be the Philippines. By this time we had an enormous force, and MacArthur was ready to land and retake the Philippines and liberate them. It turned out to be the greatest naval battle the world has ever seen, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. And there were 4 major engagements. Perhaps it's not necessary to go into the detail of all of them, but the main clash between the ships who were firing their guns, their battleship guns and 14, 16-inch guns and the 8-inch and 6-inch cruisers, was in Surigao Strait. And that took place about 4 o'clock in the morning on October the 25th. MacArthur had landed on the 20th. Just digressing for a moment, on the next day, a number of Japanese aircraft had flown around, and one of them flew straight towards Australia, the HMAS Australia, and we were slightly astern and to one side of the Australia. But our gunfire damaged it. It flew past us. We thought the lookouts thought it had touched the water, but then he recovered. He turned around, he came up our other side. Didn't attack Shropshire again, but then went for the Australia, and he hit Australia. Did a frightful lot of damage to the bridge and upper controls, and Australia had to leave that night with the Honolulu, who had been hit by a torpedo the previous afternoon. So that left, there was only Australia, there was only the Shropshire and the Arunta with the United States 7th Fleet Task Force, which was to meet the Japanese coming up through Surigao Strait. I was on watch about the middle of the night at the lookout place, and we could hear the excited voices of American torpedo boat commanders or captains as they were attacking the Japanese ships coming up still some hours away. But we knew, everybody there who was listening knew, that this was a time there there will be a naval battle. Action stations were sounded early so that we could all be ready. It was still going to be a while before the Japanese arrived. I went down to the ladders that went down to the shell room and into A turret, but I knew there was still plenty of time, so I sat there for a while thinking. All our previous operations had been pretty straightforward and we were dominant, but tonight was going to be a night that's going to be different. Who knows who's going to survive till tomorrow? And I sat there thinking for a few minutes. I thought to myself, well, do the best you can, continue to be efficient and make sure that all the machinery was working properly. I said the Lord's Prayer to myself. Now's the time to go. Went into the turret, down into A turret, down into the shell room, and stood by ready to go. When the firing started, the shells were being pushed through at an enormous rate. A turret, or in fact all the turrets, were firing a broadside, sometimes only 13, 14 seconds apart, which is unusual. A rate of fire that was probably never ever been seen before or surpassed. Then it all stopped. We're starting to get light, so we get out on deck to have a look around. There's not a Japanese ship in sight. Now it so happened that the 2 Japanese battleships, the cruiser and the 7 destroyers, were all destroyed except one destroyer who got away. Backing up the main force were 4 other Japanese cruisers, and for some reason or other, we still don't know why, they had turned around and left. I think they knew they were in trouble and they'd never get anywhere anyway. But the result of that battle was that the 2 Japanese battleships, the Yamashita, the flagship, which was our target, was sunk. The Yamashita picked us as a target amongst a lot of other American ships because we fired cordite, which had a bright yellow flash, whereas our American cruisers beside us, the Phoenix and the Boise, were flying with black gunpowder, and it doesn't light up at night as well as much as the cordite. So that it's believed something like 3 or 4 volleys from the Yamashita were directed at us, and fortunately all passed overhead and missed, but not by much. But we survived. Shortly after dawn, we get told that there's another Japanese force coming in off Seaman, and that it had attacked the light carriers. And by a divine miracle, the carriers by and large escaped. These were the light escort carriers, not equipped to do the big fighting. And the destroyers' escorts had caused so much trouble with the Japanese fleet under Kurita, Admiral Kurita, that the Japanese force got out of line and was all over the place, and it took him a long time to get it ready and into formation before proceeding to Leyte Gulf. Now, if he had proceeded to Leyte Gulf, we were in big trouble, because by a very serious miscalculation, the 7th Fleet battleships and some of the cruisers had been equipped mainly with bombarding high explosive shells and not armour-piercing shells. Whereas our captain, Nichols, this famous Captain Nichols of ours, had loaded us down with armour-piercing shells because he read the situation better than what the Americans did. So there was only a small number of forces that could go out and protect Leyte Gulf, and there was also a fuel problem. Shropshire had a better fuel supply. And so we were part of a minimal force that was sent out off Seaman to intercept this Japanese force. And at the early hours of the afternoon, I was on watch upstairs, up on the EBI, looking, what are we going to see? What's going to happen? But then we found out that the Japanese admiral, before midday, had decided that he better not proceed anymore until he got his formation back again, and he headed north and back out through San Bernardino Straits. So we were lucky to escape a very difficult situation. But the final result was that the Japanese forces were virtually decimated and destroyed. The Philippines campaign would proceed. The army was landing well. And it's interesting to note from a historical point of view that the Japanese Minister for the Navy, Vice Admiral Yonai, in interrogations in Japan after the war, he said, our defeat at Leyte was tantamount to the loss of Leyte and the Philippines. And when we lost the Philippines, that was the end of our resources. Now this is a very interesting comment. It's coming from a top man in Japan who was a cabinet minister and minister for the Navy and responsible for running the war. And what he was pointing out was that Japan's economy and war effort depended on supplies to an enormous extent coming up from Southeast Asia through the South China Seas between the Philippines and Asia. And once their food and their oil and all sorts of things were stopped, we now control the South China Sea. That is why he said that was the end of our resources. There was still a fair bit of fighting to be done, terrible fighting too, but it's a very interesting point. And it's interesting to note too, by the way, that that's the same situation here today. China is interested in controlling the South China Sea because nearly 50% of the world's maritime trade sails up and down the South China Sea between the Philippines and Asia. So the Philippines is going to be a very important part in the world again. However, now we've advanced a little bit to today. Getting back to Shropshire, we stayed in Leyte Gulf for nearly a month, defending the area. The kamikazes were now operating at their height, and we often had days where we were virtually at action stations all day long. Fortunately, we were never hit again. We managed to get on top of everything all the time. We went back to Seattle Harbour, to Manus, for supplies and have a rest, which we did in no uncertain ways and terms. The kamikazes were becoming a much more dangerous and skillful weapon. we managed to mount a lot more Bofors guns for anti-aircraft protection. We sailed back to Manus, we sailed from Manus back to Leyte Gulf, joined the main force, which was now going to be an enormous force, and headed out through Surigao Straits and past the island. Now the island of, it doesn't matter, Long Island, to get out into the South China Seas and up past Manila. The first afternoon out, the Australia was hit by a kamikaze and damaged again. This time it was a kamikaze, it was a definite kamikaze attack. The previous time it was only an independent suicide operation. But now the kamikazes were at their force. They also hit one of our escort carriers and she sank. But the Australia was able to continue on. The whole journey took us about, I think, 3 days before we got off Lingayen Gulf. We were to go in with the fleet, with the United States 7th Fleet, with all their battleships and cruisers, of which we were 2 of them, at dawn on the 6th of January 1945 now. And we're all at action stations, still pitch dark. The skipper comes on the line and says, "This is going to be a very difficult operation. I'm going to ask you all to maintain your gunfire, particularly the anti-aircraft guns and crews, till the last second, even if you think he's coming at you and he's going to hit you. The last shot we fire might be the shot that saves the day." Fair enough, yeah, that's okay, typical message. And then he said, he did something very different. He said, "Oh Lord, we will be busy this day. If we forget you, do not thou forget us." Now that is a very ancient prayer of the British Army that was quoted by Lord Reading before a battle in the Civil War in about 1640, and has become known as the soldier's prayer. Now, we'll never know the answer to this, but this vast force of ours goes in and we're going to be there for 3 days under attack before the main force arrive. And out of this vast fleet, 6 battleships, I think there were 14 cruisers and whatnot, that were going to do the bombardments. We were operating there for 3 days and only 4 ships were not hit, and Shropshire was one of them. So you might consider and think about this, and we'll never know the answer, but perhaps there is such a thing as divine intervention. Perhaps the skipper's prayer saved the day. You never know, do you? We'll never know. Okay. After Lingayen Gulf, everything started to settle down. We got on top. Then we did the bombardment at Corregidor. The Americans had a airborne division, number 5, I think it was 501, it doesn't matter. And the army is ready at the end of the baton to come to do a landing on the foreshore. So we do a bombardment, then we come around to the front of Corregidor to see what was happening on land, and we're out a few thousand yards from the end of the Corregidor fortress, which was an enormous hill with It's headquarters offices and buildings on top, but a cliff of probably between 200 and 300 feet on the front. And we're wondering what's going to happen. I'm on watch on the Port Evershed bearing indicator at 8 o'clock after the bombardment, and I hear from the back of us, stern, a sound growing. Hello, what's that? And I managed to turn around, look around, and I see these two lines of aircraft, the old Dakota, the DC-3, coming in. There's dozens and dozens of them. Two in line, they fly over us, straight for the Corregidor Island headquarters there, where the headquarters were, and the parachute troops start dropping out. It was a fascinating sight, one of the most remarkable sights I have ever seen. A couple of the parachutists misjudged the jump, and their parachutes were caught on the cliffs, and there they were dangling, and I believe they were rescued afterwards. But most of them managed to get ashore. They were landing on tops of the buildings, which are now all occupied by Japanese people, whatnot. But they got away because of it was such a surprise attack. They got away with very few casualties, we learnt afterwards. And obviously our earlier bombardments had helped a lot too. And before long we could see that the American paratroopers were all over the place in control. So that was very interesting. That night we sailed back to Lingayen Gulf. Things were quietening down now, we were settling down. We were there for another week, I think, a fortnight, and finally we got the message. You've been at sea. We had been at sea for 10 months. A lot of that time nobody had ever got ashore. I used to get ashore on working parties at Seattle Harbour to go to Manus to pick up supplies or do all sorts of things. But a lot of the chaps had never been off the ship for 10 months. And here we were sailing home. We got home, big clean up, big refit, etc., etc., etc. All had 3 weeks leave. Back on board Shropshire, and then we finally get the orders out to sea, do a few exercises, test this, test that, make sure everything's running properly. Then we're heading back to New Guinea and the Philippines. But instead of the Philippines, we go across to Borneo, where the 9th Division and the 7th Division were going to do an operation there, which was sad in a way. We could not understand. We are now several thousand or 1,500 kilometres south of the Philippines, where all the fighting had taken place. The Japanese were being pushed back into their homeland. Why did we send people to Borneo to fight in jungles and to die? The Japanese had no supplies, they had no aircraft, very little food. We should have just forgot about them, left them alone. But I'll never know the reason for this, but there are obviously some political decisions made in Canberra about keeping the army occupied, and Borneo was to be a target. And it'd be interesting to know exactly what went on in the minds of all the people who planned it. I suppose this is one of the reasons why I have dedicated the last years of my life to letting people know something of the naval history. the Navy played a most important part in the defeat of Japan, and especially in the liberation of the Philippines. But this story has never been told adequately, accurately or properly to the people of Australia. So that's why I have written the book and conducted many functions, particularly here on the Gold Coast, to let people know what happened in 1944-45 so that the Allies could win the war. To me, a very important part. Anyway, after we did a few bombardments in Borneo, we go back to Manila to join the 7th Fleet, and we do a few little operations there. And then eventually one morning we're told it must have been a broadcast within half an hour or so of the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima. A signal must have flashed across the Navy circuit straight away. And we're told that a new type bomb had destroyed a city in Japan. Oh, well, that's interesting. Yeah, very good, very good. But we still had to paint the ship and chip the rust away and do all the work that had to be done. And so that's what we're doing. And then a few days later, about the same time, there's an announcement made. We are, another one of these atomic bombs has been dropped on Nagasaki. Ooh, now that really sounds interesting. We knew that we would be part of the force that bombarded the Japanese mainland before the first army invasion to retake and destroy Japan. We also knew that we had gone through the last year and a half, 2 years, unscathed. The Japanese kamikazes were still numerous. I'm not too sure how many, but I believe they still had something like 1,000 odd aircraft that could fly. We knew that we were going to cop it. The first waves that attacked Japan would be in big trouble. And we thought to ourselves, well, sooner or later, Shropshire would have to get hit. Then we hear the news about it looks like there's going to be a surrender and peace, so we all breathed a sigh of relief. Pretty good. The next thing we know, we're being ordered to get ready to go to sea, and we sail off with the Hobart, I think the Arunta Warramunga Bataan had joined us. We stop at Okinawa for a few hours, and then we proceed on, and we're in Tokyo Bay, August the 28th, from memory. And of course we're all on tenterhooks because we're wondering, this terrible enemy that we've been fighting now for so many years, what was it going to be like in their territory? Everything seemed to be under control. We find a spot off Yokohama to anchor. Lots of other American ships there. The British Pacific Fleet was there. This is not too bad. The weather was fine. Peace at last. On the morning of the 22nd, we got all the radios on to listen to what was happening on the Missouri. A huge number of aircraft flew past in a victory parade to let the Japanese know we were there as well in the air. And a peacetime routine was gradually being put into place. a few days later, I'm called to the ship's office along with about, I don't know, 20 other blokes. Oh, there's going to be a ceremony at the British Embassy to raise the flag for the first time in 4.5 years. And the British Lord Fraser, the Admiral, has said he'd be happy to have a small party of Australians there as well. So we were going to be it. Now why I was chosen, I don't know, just the luck of the draw perhaps. A destroyer comes alongside. Oh, we had to be dressed in white British uniform too, which we didn't like. The white shorts, the Bombay bloomers, you know, we cut them down to size like a proper Australian shorts, you see. And we got them from the KG5. We went over there and they got we were fitted out with the stuff. So the next day, we were going to go ashore. A destroyer takes us up to the South Tokyo wharves, and we're thinking to ourselves, you know, what's this going to be like? We're going to land on Japanese territory. And see, it's interesting to note, we'd been at sea for 2 years on bombarding Japanese, never seen a Japanese person. They were always thousands of yards away. Eh? Our destroyer pulls in alongside a wharf, and the blokes, they throw lines across and we step ashore, and there's a dais there, and a Japanese, I presume he was a customs officer. He's up on the dais, and he's got about 12, 15 other blokes there. They're in line, and they're all saluting us as we pull up and step ashore. Oh, this is interesting. Is it different? This is not bad. So he salutes and we salute back, and American Army trucks are there to take us to the embassy. We go through all the downtown Tokyo area, and later on I learnt a lot about what happened. The Japanese housing suburbs, as you probably know, were not built with bricks and stone and whatnot. It was timber and wood and timber and paper and whatnot, you know. And tens of thousands of people lived in these suburban areas. And the policy beforehand, back 6 months before, had been to bomb with the B-29s, to bomb the military targets. But General May, the Air Force bloke in charge, said they soon realised that that bombing a military installation was not a lot of use, because they were disciplined, and within days they had the place back in working order. So May decided, and I dare say he got plenty of approval from it from other places, from higher up, and his words were, "We'll terrorise the population." So instead of using high explosives, they conducted 2 enormous fire incendiary raids on Tokyo, and the area that we were now going through in these army trucks had a few people left, old women, old men, scratching around amongst the ashes, little kids. And I thought to myself, good God, you know, this is pretty crook, this is terrible. We found out, and later on when I read more of history, that those incendiary raids had destroyed that area in particular, probably burnt alive 110 to 120,000 civilians. Just unbelievable. This is what war does to people, eh? The city of Tokyo officials, the police and fire brigades and hospitals never coped. They still didn't know exactly how many people had been killed. It's just unbelievable, you know? Anyway, we get, that was all for reflection and learning about things later on. We get to the embassy. General MacArthur was there, Lord Fraser, General Thomas Blamey, the Australian, our Commodore Collins, later on Vice Admiral Collins, our own Captain Nichols, of course. We were put on the end of the line. Mainly the British troops, the sailors were in front of the main building where the flag was raised. They had a bit of a ceremony. And then off the go the official party to somewhere to a formal victory lunch. And we were left in the grounds of the embassy. The Japanese staff had still stayed there all that time, looked after the place. It was immaculate, and they brought us out magnificent parcels of food and tons of Japanese ice-cold beer. To our English compatriots, we said, well, look, you can take the food and what they'll go, give us the beer. And we all got in a bunch together, as that photo, you see that photograph, and we're hopping into the grog. We thought, this beer's not bad, these Japs can't be too bad, they make a pretty good drop of beer. Yeah. After we'd had our bit of lunch and a few bottles, we're exploring through the building, or the buildings. There's a nice big office with a big desk in it. I presume it was the ambassador's office. The 2 or 3 of us went in there, look around. Not much there, it was all the necessary things had been taken away, but I opened a drawer and there's some visiting cards which you see over there. Gold embossed with the coat of arms Duo Mondroit, beautifully done. They're fairly heavy cards. They must have been used as visiting cards or invitation cards. And I grab a few of them into my pocket, into my jacket, into my tunic. We picked up a few other things and took them back. Right, we're now going to go back to the wharves and back to Shropshire. So next morning, I look at these cards, I think, now this is a little piece of history. In those days in the Navy, sailors and the ship's company or the crew, they never went aft where the officers' quarters were. That was taboo, you know. However, I've been on the ship now for a couple of years and I know everybody, and I've got these cards from the embassy. Down I go. The Commodore, the Admiral's suite, aft there, bang bang on the door. A steward or a secretary opens the door. What do you want? I said, is Commodore Collins here? And he was sitting at a desk and he saw me, because I'd been one of his lookouts when he was our captain. Oh, come in, lad. What do you want? And I said, yesterday at the embassy, I pinched those. Oh, he said, oh. Ooh. Well, he said, that's interesting. I said, would you like to autograph it? Yes, so he autographed it. Go into the next suite where Captain Nichols is. Bang on the door. What do you want? I want to see Captain Nichols. Nichols did the same. Oh, he said, it's you, lad. He said, come in, sit down. What's happening? And I said, here, I got those from the embassy yesterday. Oh, he said, oh. I said, would you sign it? He signed it. Off I go and went around the ship, because I knew hundreds of people by now and I knew all the blokes that were on the party, and I got most of them to autograph it. There it is. It's a piece of Australian history. What happens to it after I go, I don't know. But there is a record, a unique record, from the British Embassy at the surrender in Tokyo in September 1945. There we are. We stayed in Japan for another month or two, a few months, did a couple of trips up and down. We used to, by this time we could go ashore. You go into the Ginza, the big shopping centre of, famous shopping centre of Tokyo now. It was even in those days. You could walk in and out of the shops. The staff looked after you, particularly the girls, the young women, the servant, who did the cashier jobs and things. And life proceeded as though, well, we found it was difficult to understand. These people, you could talk to them and look after them if they spoke English, or they could look after you just as though nothing had ever happened. I was quite astonished, really. Anyway, eventually we get the signal. By this time, by the way, I've organised for myself one of the best jobs on the ship. Up on the compass platform in the control area, but at the back of that there was an office with a signals petty officer and a few staff, signalmen, and as signals came and went, he typed out the signal. It had to go to the captain or the commander or the whatever department, and they needed a messenger, a signals distribution office messenger. Oh, that was the plum job of the ship, and I'm one of them now. There's two of us doing this job. So our job was to take messages to the skipper or the commander or whatever, you know. And we get the message, we're going to sail. Off we go, and halfway home down through the Pacific, there's a message. The signals petty officer bloke types it. He says, hey, take this to the captain. And he folded over. You don't see that? I said, no, I couldn't care less. I'll just take it to the captain. Captain was around the corner on the compass platform. He looked at it. He said, oh, Commander Supply, bring him up here. So he comes up. He says, we've got a signal from Canberra. The Army's having trouble getting men back from New Guinea, lack of transport and whatnot. Can we call in at WWII and pick up some Army people? How many could we take? He said, we could probably take 200. Right, and the skipper writes out a reply and I take it back to the distribution office. Off it goes. About a day and a half, 2 days later at dawn, we're off WWII. They lower the Mediterranean ladder on the side to let people to come up on the ship, and there are boats and canoes and rafts paddling from the shore from everywhere. The word had got around from amongst a couple of the army depots that there would be a ship coming in, the cruiser Shropshire, and she'll take some men home. A lot of these blokes just said, well, we're not waiting to be picked to go in the number, we're going. So they just came out, they just floated out and started climbing aboard with their kit bags. Yeah? They were hopeless, they didn't know how to get aboard and all that sort of stuff. So, sailors get down there to help the army. So here we are helping them with their gear up the Mediterranean ladder, and I befriended 2 or 3 of these blokes. They came from South Australia too, by the way, so they knew where I was born. And that was our responsibility then, to look after them and take them home. We get home to Sydney, given more leave. Back, that would have been middle of December, end of December. We get back to Sydney in time for Christmas and New Year, and then we're told we're going to do a bit of a showing the flag cruise. So we sailed to Melbourne, spent a week in Melbourne, big parade, visiting family and friends, taking visitors aboard, showing them the ship. Then we sailed to Hobart, Hobart was an ideal place, a very naval-minded city, Hobart, in those days. In Sydney, the few times we were back in Sydney, there would be each morning quite a few people before the commander's table for the trouble they'd caused in Sydney overnight. Sydney was sly grog, all sorts of things, black marketeering stuff. There would always be a few blokes getting into trouble. 6 o'clock closing, shortage of grog, that sort of stuff. But Hobart, the pubs were open till 10 o'clock. They were all homely, friendly places. We got to know people, we talked to people. We were invited to some of their homes for meals and things. I don't think anybody ever got into trouble. It was a very interesting situation. But anyway, eventually we had to leave Hobart. We come back to Sydney, and I'm thinking to myself, it's going to be a long time before young people like me, and I'd only been there just on 2.5, 3 years, all the old long servers have got a lot of points, demobilisation points. They'll all be going off home. We get into Sydney, tie up, I think, number 2 boy, I'm not sure, doesn't matter. The loudspeakers come on, the following ratings report for draft. And I thought, oh, that won't be me, because I'll be only one of the young blokes. And names are coming out, and I thought, hang on, some of those blokes haven't been on board the ship or seen the action I have. Sure enough, up comes the name Mattiske. Pack your bags, get ready to go ashore this afternoon. Whew, off we go. I didn't have time to say goodbye to all my friends or go around and see anybody really, just a couple of them. There were 3 blokes from Victoria that I knew. We were together. And off we went. Back to Lonsdale Depot. And we potted around there for a while, dodging jobs. We'd disappear in the morning, come back and later on. At last the Chief Petty Officer said, I got to have you on me watch bill because you're causing me, otherwise you'll cause me trouble. I got to give you a job. Oh, he said, look, here's some bus tickets. You go down to Flinders Lane. Does anybody Melbourne? 330 Melbourne, Flinders Lane. Oh, all right, we go down there. There's an office there, Naval Patrol. Oh no, we're not going to become naval policemen at this time of life. So we walk inside, and Johnny Muir was with me, and Stan Selleck, the 3 of us. Out comes a warrant officer to meet us from his office. It's Johnny Muir's father. We said, what goes on here? He said, listen, fellas, he said, don't worry about having to be policemen. My policy is to look after blokes. If anybody gets into trouble, you bring them back here and give them a cup of tea and take them back to their depot or ships and just keep them out of trouble. Oh, that sounds all right. We'll do that. And then he said, you'll be in charge of a party, in charge of leading seamen. And he calls this bloke over. It's Johnny Coombe, the former Shropshire bloke, leading seaman Johnny Coombe. So we had a ball then for the next few weeks, going around in the evenings to the picture theatres and making sure everybody was behaving themselves, and they were. The ushers, the girl ushers and the ticket sellers, all come in, lads, have a look at the pictures, while you're here. That was a very nice way to end the war. And finally, one morning, Righto, you get up to Royal Park. You know where Royal Park is? Near the zoo? There's the big army depot there. What for? You're being demobilised. Off we go. There were about 2 or 3 of us again. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, they'd issued us with a new civvy suit and a shirt and trousers. Sign all the papers. Off you go. That was it. My naval career was over. Back home. Well, the history of it is, and I don't know a lot of the history, but roughly, the 7th Fleet was always based at Subic Bay in the Philippines. And of course it had a run. It had no hope when the Japanese attacked. It got pushed out of the way, destroyed or whatever. And then when MacArthur got to Australia and he had his headquarters up there in Brisbane, the Phoenix had already come here to Australia not long after Pearl Harbor, and she operated out of Perth with other Australian ships. Then she was brought around to the east coast here. There was the Phoenix, the Australia, and the destroyers, the Fletcher class destroyers, and the Arunta and Warramunga, the Australian ones. And MacArthur finally either did it by himself or had orders, I don't know, but they reconstituted the 7th Fleet. So the 7th Fleet was then formed with headquarters here in Brisbane. But that moved out very quickly out to New Guinea and whatnot there. But it started off from Milne Bay, Shropshire, Australia, Phoenix, Nashville. The Fletcher class destroyers, the Ammon, the Bash, oh, there was a few of them. These were very good Fletcher class destroyers. They were brilliant ships. I'll have a list of the whole lot of them in there, but it doesn't matter, that's enough. And then they put what was called the landing ship infantry, the LSIs, and they were the old coastal liners, the Westralia, the Manura. They did the initial training down at north of Newcastle. It's a now famous holiday resort and bay. It was known, the Navy had it as a depot called HMAS Assault, and they perfected the business of getting troops from a ship into landing craft and running them ashore. And with all due respect to our American friends, they did it far better later on than the Americans ever did it. They were noted for being very efficient. So after our bombardments, these ships would be following us and loading their troops into the landing craft to run ashore and do the infantry assault. Eh? But then after we took the Admiralty Islands, MacArthur had a huge base built there, including a floating dock, which could take a battleship, believe it or not. It was unbelievable. And we understand, and I haven't got an exact count on this, but I understand probably 1 million men passed through that depot at Lorengo Manus as the war grew up, as the war progressed and the assaults got bigger and bigger and bigger to the Philippines. Then, then we got there was the Phoenix, the Nashville, the Boise. Everybody knows where the Phoenix is, and everybody knows Nashville because of the music. Now, then there were several of the 8-inch gun cruisers, the Portland, the Honolulu. I've got a list of them all there, but anyway, we started to get bigger and bigger, and then we got aircraft carriers, the CVEs, the light escort carriers. We had, I think, 12 of them for the Philippines campaign, so it was an enormous force. Oh, then the other battleships arrived. California, West Virginia, the Maryland, Pennsylvania. There was another one. There were 6 of them. But the whole of the 7th Fleet was divided up into, we didn't always sail together, we were in different groups to do different jobs. Most people in Australia, certainly all the southern states, Victoria, Tasmania, South Australia, West Australia, they all know the famous song, "Up There, Kazali." You'd know that too, wouldn't you? Absolutely. In there and fight. Roy Kazali Senior was a member, a ruckman, but a famous high flyer to take a high mark in the South Melbourne side that won the premiership in 1933. His son Roy Kazali, they'd come from Tasmania and lived in Melbourne, and before the war, young Roy was going to be a brilliant footballer, and he and his father played in a reserves game for South Melbourne in the VFL. I believe it's the only time in history of Aussie rules where a father and a son has played in an official game. Now, I'm mentioning all this because Roy Kazali Jr. joined the Navy. And guess where he was drafted to? Shropshire. He was a leading seaman by this time and in charge of the port pom-poms, which is a unit with, I think, 6 or 8, 6 pom-pom guns on it that all swiveled and were controlled together. And at Lingayen Gulf, Roy Kazali was responsible at least twice of shooting down or damaging kamikazes, which then missed us. Otherwise we would have been hit, like all the other ships were being hit. See? And for that, Roy Kazali was awarded the DSM. Probably should have been even a higher value award, but he was one of our very famous men on board HMAS Shropshire. And we saw Roy from time to time at reunions later on. He used to come to Queensland a lot. He had friends up here in Brisbane, but then sadly cancer knocked him. He was down in the Gold Coast Hospital, down at John Flynn, and they told me, family had come up from Hobart, they said, "You better come and see Dad." So Dee and I went down there, and we shown in the family around. Poor old Roy was obviously not far to go, but they said, "Here, come on David, come over and say hello." Roy opened his eyes, looked at me, he saw me, big smile. Oh, he said, "How are you?" "All right." I said, "Okay, Roy, settle down. Just be happy now." He closed his eyes again. And Dee used to tell me quite often afterwards, thank God we went down to see him at that time before he passed away. Because one of his last moments on this earth would be seeing one of his old shipmates. Yeah. I think everybody understands that Australia is really a very fine place to live in. It's got a lot of things going for it. It's a remarkable nation and organisation. We have predominantly the main uniting philosophical force of the nation is the Anzac spirit, and that's got to be maintained. So the RSL right throughout Australia has got to understand its role in the nation. I with three other blokes on the state executive of Victoria, RSL in those days in the 60s and 70s, instead of sitting in an office at headquarters dictating policy, we made a point of going out periodically to the different areas of the nation, of the state, where we would call together all the sub-branch presidents and secretaries and office bearers, shire presidents, town mayors, quite often the local member of parliament, and we would have a seminar for probably Friday night, Saturday night. And the one thing I learnt, an important thing I learnt, was that in all these communities there are lots of good things. The local race club, tennis club, golf club, football club, whatever. But there was, and sometimes that even divided people into different groups. But the one thing that put all people together in one group in the community was the RSL. Very important fact. It's the bearer of the Anzac spirit. People forget that the Commonwealth was only a few years old. People still thought of themselves as Victorians, New South Walesmen, West Australians or whatever. But the First World War and the Anzac spirit made everybody think of Australia. Now, I think it's being commemorated properly and adequately. The RSL is virtually the custodian of the Anzac spirit, which we talked about before. Ken Orr made a very interesting observation on Anzac Day or after Anzac Day. He said if on the Gold Coast you totted up the people who attended the various services in the morning, Runaway Bay, Nerang, here, Surfers, Currumbin, the attendances are very good. But he estimated that because people were asked to do it at home, the response was unbelievable, and possibly there were more people on the Gold Coast standing to at dawn on Anzac Day this year than would have normally attended all the other services. It's a very interesting observation. So perhaps the the RSL and the state and federal governments have got to look at this very closely and find out what is the best way to continue and grow the Anzac spirit which makes the nation. I don't know any specific answer to it or to the future, but I just hope and pray all the time that Anzac Day will be continued to be the main day of Australia. I know we have a lot of other days, and I don't want to get into arguments about them, either they're pros or cons. But none of the other days which we celebrate is anything like as important as Anzac Day. Perhaps the only controversial thing I can say with a sense of humour is that Anzac Day is of course dominated by the army because they are the vast numbers. I'd like to see more naval things taking place on Anzac Day. That's enough, isn't it?